Uh, Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this talk on global internet governance. Just a few points of order to get out of the way before we begin. The general format of today's talk will follow along the lines of an initial lecture by Dr. Beall, followed by a Q&A period. As such, please keep yourself muted unless called upon, and if you have any questions that come up as the lecture progresses, please feel free to put them in the chat or hold on to them until the lecture portion concludes. With that, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Chris Beall. Chris is the policy lead for the project on platform governance of the Center for International Governance Innovation, also known as SIGI, where he is currently heading the project on the Global Platform Governance Network. Chris has previously occupied directorships within the Government of Canada, in both the Departments of Canadian Heritage as well as Canadian Border Services Agency, as well as Parks Canada. He's also a college fellow from Carleton University's College of Public Affairs. Go Ravens. And thank you, Chris, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation to come and talk to you guys today. I'm just going to try and share my screen. I've got just a few slides just so you don't have to stare at the Zoom background of my basement for the next period of time. Let me see if I can easily make this work. Just hold on 1 second. Okay. I think this will work. Apologize for the technical challenge. And I would keep talking, but I struggled to do the two things at once. Okay, so this should be coming through. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. Excellent. So today what I'm going to talk to you about, essentially what we're going to be talking about, actually more than global internet governance, and I should have corrected that, Ethan, I'm sorry, I should have corrected before, but really is more global platform governance. What I want to get at is more than simply the nuts and bolts, the infrastructure behind the internet, but really thinking about the how it is that we engage with the tech companies that really form the way in which almost all of us around the world really do engage with our internet space and in the online world. Oh, essay, welcome. That's great. And as you know, and as we were just talking about before the meeting started, these issues of governing digital platforms is now more important than ever. Just as a kind of couple of words of my own sort of to start off, one of them is I'd say in the presentation, I'm going to try to avoid using jargon or relying too much on your prior knowledge. I know everyone comes at these things with a different set of understanding. So I'm just going to kind of, I'll explain things as I go along. But if I use some terms you don't understand, or if a point isn't clear, please feel free to put your hand up or to jump in and stop me and have me go over it. And there'll be lots of time for discussion at the end of the presentation. But if there's something that's really burning, I have absolutely no problem whatsoever if you want to join in. And sorry, Ethan, I don't want to take away from the rules of the of engagement. So here, I'm going to go to the next slide. Great. So what's the scope of the challenge? And why does this matter? You'll see here some of the pictures from various impacts of the challenges we're having in the disinformation space and in the social media space right now. You know,
Chris,
we talk.
Sorry to interrupt real quick. We currently are mostly seeing your notes section.
Oh, weird. Okay.
Yeah. So I just wanted to let you know.
Okay, thank you. That's the wrong one. So this is, oh, okay. How frustrating.
That's all right.
Thanks for letting me know. It's supposed to be this one. Nope, and that's opening like that as well. Sorry.
Maybe hide presenter view might be.
That's what I'm trying to figure out. Oh, there we are.
Just yeah, there. Oh,
is it now?
it's now directly on you.
Okay, let me try this one more time.
Yeah, sure,
it's funny. I've done this a few times and it's never been a problem. Let's see if this is. No, that's not the right one.
Oh, there we are. We're perfect.
Okay, you can now see. Okay, that's great.
Yep.
Excellent.
All right.
Okay.
Sorry for the
Thank you. No. I very much appreciate that. Great. Um, you know, so I think a lot of us last week were glued to our television screens as we were watching the invasion of the Capitol after President Trump's call to arms, but really after a tremendous amount of both radicalization and organization on online forums, some open, some closed. But what was really striking is there was a bit of a sense in US law enforcement, and I think this is what they're coming to terms with now, that somehow there wasn't going to be a connection between this online conversation and what would happen in the online world. And yet, as we've seen, there is a strong connection between these kinds of events, these sort of online discussions, online coordination, to an offline happening and an offline impact on people. And we've seen this digital media-driven assaults on democracy, on society, and on individuals, both at a global scale, so like last week, and on individual levels, and we'll talk about that in a moment. In fact, I'd say since 2016, the issue of disinformation in civic life has become probably one of the most present considerations as we talk about how we engage with each other, as how we talk about how we engage with other people. All of us were seized with Russian hacking operations during the election of Donald Trump. And I think for those people who've been engaged with these kinds of issues, they realize, we sometimes joke, especially when we talk to partners in the Global South, it's not like disinformation began in 2016. These things have run through various parts of the world. There have been foreign state actors involved. We've seen Russian hacking operations in Syria, in former Eastern European countries, in these other kinds of areas. And it's on a global scale as well. The UN found Facebook compliant in the Rohingya genocide, for example. We looked at issues of disinformation in the Syrian war. We can go on, and I think a lot of us have lots of experiences or read lots of different pieces around these issues. But what's really striking is, the extent to which the digital platforms have been gamed or used by these companies, by these countries to be able to make these changes. It's also non-state actors. And so, I know some of you are probably studying Daesh and their use of the internet, incel movements, alt-right, white nationalists. There's a transnational playbook that's being used to really leverage what's available online to be able to make changes in the offline world and to be able to impact the offline world around us. And what's amazing over the past years, as we've seen, as the pandemic has really taken hold and we've been moved into lockdown and all of these different things around the world, we've also seen these same kinds of issues really come even more strongly. So it wasn't simply the US election. Over the past year, we also saw COVID-19 misinformation, the spread of fake news, the spread of fake ideas, and something that's really striking, and you may have experienced this as well. When I worked on this previously, when we were talking in the Canadian government and preparing for the federal election in 2019, when I talked to friends and family about the issues that we were working on, there was a sense of otherness to it. So we'd present and talk about, there's this disinformation campaign or these other things going on, and people would laugh it off and say, oh, isn't it crazy that people believe this? And I found during the COVID-19 situation, what was so striking is that friends and family, the same groups of people would actually be sharing the misinformation with me. And so you may have seen this as well. You get, emails from interested family members who say, you really have to check this out. This doctor at Johns Hopkins is recommending this course of action. And it takes you about 2 seconds to read it and realize that this isn't real, because there's no public health unit in the world that's going to be contradicting the public health advice of the government for which it's operating. There's all of these different triggers and signals. But what we've seen is these fake ideas, how much they can seize, how much they can grab hold of people, and how much they can affect our real world behavior. The classic example that I can talk about is the attack on 5G towers, which happened in the UK, in North America. And funnily enough, it actually happened in New Zealand, where they don't have 5G and they're not planning to have 5G for a number of years. But there became this real fear that was being pushed out online by these different people that the 5G technology would somehow break down your cellular structure and make you more susceptible to catching COVID. And so there were people going out and attacking workers and the towers themselves. Just to finish this off, we can sort of see the explosion of beliefs in QAnon. You can see I've got the picture here, which has gone, I find so interesting because it's now gone beyond its original author, who's not actually posted more than 5 times and hasn't posted in 35 days since Donald Trump was elected. But it's now taken on a life of its own. In fact, has a international component across Europe and around the world. And the stolen election myths. What's common about all these things? And what makes this an important issue, that is global platform governance, a necessary issue for us to be worrying about, is that each one of these is contributing to undermining democracy and is contributing to an attack on truth. So what I find very striking compared to, say, historic views of the way we challenge different political perspectives, it used to be that there was a set of facts, roughly, and people largely believed in those and then argued about their meaning and their import or how they should be interpreted. What's going on now is there's a push to deny that facts exist. That, you know, we talked about, you know, alternative truths. These kinds of things have become more sort of central to our vocabulary over the last 3 or 4 years. But what they're really doing, and this is sort of part of major Russian disinformation campaigns, there's really a push to say there is no objective truth and there's nothing that we can react against. And it really then draws away from our ability to have discourse with each other. We can't enter into a conversation where we're able to talk about how we disagree. I think something that's so striking about the example from last week in the Capitol wasn't simply that protesters were able to breach the Capitol defenses and come in, and the complicity of the Capitol Police in some ways. But it's also actually now some of the stories that are coming out about the potential complicity of Republican House members, who, at least in one case, tweeted out the location of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, arguably for her to then be able to be open to attack. And AOC's admission in an interview yesterday that she did not go into hiding with other members, as she figured that some of the other members would actually tweet her location so that the protesters who showed up with zip ties, ropes, and weapons would be able to assault her or kill her. This is such a shift from the way in which we've seen facts before. I mean, there's sort of those of you who are involved with political science have known, no doubt, about, you know, the many stories of political discourse in houses of parliament around the world where people might argue strong positions, but then afterward, they actually were able to exchange with and connect with, and in some cases, draw close friendships with people on the other sides of the House, both in the US, Canada, and the UK, and other places where this is sort of a common fact. And I think what we're really seeing with this push towards disinformation is moving away from this. And I think, you know, it's evident that this is linked to an overall world decline in democracy. It's worth checking out if you don't know it. The Freedom House study on democracy, I think it's now the 14th year of consecutive decline in democratic systems around the world. And this, the sort of control of online platforms in this work is actually really contributing to that decline and that place where we're seeing now. I should say that this isn't solely about the sort of the larger issues of democracy in society either. There's a personal level to the scope of the problem of the current online environment, and especially the platform environment. You know, we've seen a radical growth in revenge porn, child sexual exploitation. There's a reinforcing of racist and misogynist ideas. And on the other side of things, and well beyond the scope of today, but just to kind of put it there in terms of the overall conversation, there's also issues around algorithmic decision-making and the impact on reinforcing poverty and reinforcing social structures that negatively affect marginalized people in society. And this isn't even getting into the business and cultural aspects of the problem, as we see digital platforms who can use their market power to scoop up competitors and limit innovation. Some of you, I imagine, would have followed with interest Epic's battle with the App Store over the Unreal Engine and in-game purchasing, at the risk of Fortnite being taken offline. But it really speaks to the sort of the market power, the market dominance of a very small number of players who remain largely unregulated and largely uncontrolled in this whole world of managing this online disinformation. Now, I should say, I presented a very negative picture. That's the point of this conversation. There is, of course, an incredibly positive picture of the relationship we have with the internet, of the benefit of the platforms, even in fact, the ability of us to have this conversation right now and to be able to meet with and talk to colleagues around the world about these issues is an important element of the benefits that we get from this world. But it is really worth noting that the negatives have been allowed to increase in a particular way without warning because of the way we're structured, because of the way we as societies and we as governments have approached these issues. And really, I would say this is a very long way from where we anticipated the World Wide Web would go in the heady early days of the internet. Some of you who may know who've studied this, and there's some great, it's worth reading some great early quotes from Berners-Lee, the sort of noted founder of the internet, or Bill Gates or others who sort of talked about this incredible force that the internet would free us and open us up. There's even Noam Chomsky early on talked about this sort of democratizing force of the internet. Where we've ended up now, though, is I think the result of the way in which we've acted towards the internet over the last 10 or 15 years. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next section of this conversation. But before that, I want to draw one more point of note of the capital invasion. So something that's really instructive, I think, is tracking to see what digital platforms have done since Donald Trump incited the crowd and since the crowd invaded the Capitol building. So they've fallen over themselves to take action. It's worth checking, and if anybody'd like, I can post the link afterward. First Draft, which you may know is a project that fights disinformation online. It's a NGO that fights disinformation. They've published a long list of the actions that platforms have taken. I think it's about 8 or 9 pages. So I mean, most famously, they deplatformed Trump, but there are lots of different actions taken against Parler, against different actors, against different people in this space. But I think it's important to recognize that this is not, that the situation we're in is not a failure of tech companies to patrol content. It may partly be that, and it's maybe partly a failure of tech companies to properly think about their terms of service and the way they apply them. But I think more importantly, as Taylor Owen pointed out in a paper last year, this is a failure of governments. This is a failure of governments to regulate a risky and potentially dangerous technology. Tech companies do need support and guidance. Facebook on a number of occasions, whether one can debate whether or not it was meaningful, but have asked for regulation, have invited some level of a level playing field or a clear platform in which to operate. And they've now, as you probably know, set up their external sort of Supreme Court that they've developed to help them regulate and decide, make decisions on ideas. Jack Dorsey's talked about this as well as Twitter, is they don't want to be in a position to have to make these kinds of tough decisions, and yet we've left them there because we've given a lack of guidance. You know, it's interesting. I was at a colloquium a couple of years ago, a small closed thing, and one of the YouTube executives responsible for content moderation was talking about trying to chase down their legal counsel as the Christchurch attacks were being reposted. So some of you may remember when the shooter was murdering Muslims in New Zealand, he was simultaneously posting it, and then for the next 24 hours, people were videoing it and reposting. One of the challenges that YouTube has, they didn't have a policy for automated takedown, and it wasn't matching their individual takedown speeds, so they couldn't keep up with it. But they didn't have a policy, but more importantly, they didn't have any guidance or framework or anything set up for how they should manage this. So I'm going to talk about that more, but I just kind of want to leave that in your mind as we talk about the scope and why it matters. So now, how do we get here? So as you can see, I've got sort of 3 key things that I'm pulling up. The laissez-faire approach to regulation, lack of domestic and international coordination, and the nature of the platforms themselves. As I've said, an open internet was really believed, at least at the start, that this was going to be an essential building block of the liberal world order. It was thought that it would be so self-evident when people had access to the internet, they would be able to connect with each other, they would be able to find democratic solutions to problems, they would hear each other, and this openness, this diversity of voices would inevitably overcome the problems of repressive regimes and totalitarian regimes. In fact, it's one of the reasons why the US government was instrumental in setting up the Onion router to provide space for activists and countries to be able to connect with each other, to be able to talk to each other, because they thought this would be so essential. I don't think there was any intention that the dark web would end up being the place where it is now, the sort of marketplace for drugs, child pornography, weapons, violence. You know, it was just a very different way of thinking. What was interesting too is there was a notion that, and this still runs through a lot of the conversations now, there was a belief that if liberal democracies put in rules on the internet, they would be giving succor to or sort of emboldening the illiberal regimes to sort of use those same kinds of rules to explain what they were doing in their own countries. And there's some truth to this. Some of you may have seen Justitia, which is a think tank based in Denmark. Jacob Mashingama, I'm sorry, I've never said his name out loud, who's a brilliant writer and really worth reading his paper. His team did an analysis in 2019, and then they again redid it this year. And they looked at how many regimes around the world leveraged German NetzDG law, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but is basically their online hate legislation. They used that to justify their laws in their own countries, and really as a way to crack down on political dissidents in their own countries through sort of using the words of online hate. And this is very similar for those of you who've done foreign policy to, you know, sort of totalitarian or illiberal regimes using the terminology of democracy to apply their own sort of approaches to thinking. I would say though, and I think the sort of consideration that I always have when I look at this issue is I say, this is true that this would it could give credence to those countries. At the same time, the lack of regulation hasn't stopped China from building its Great Firewall. It hasn't stopped it deploying, and it's now exporting its very tightly controlled version of the internet. In fact, all it's done is it's enabled the development of a consumer internet, a private sector run internet that sees us not as users or activists or participants, but rather as customers. One of my colleagues in a paper on this brilliantly said, we sometimes talk about the internet as being the public square, but actually our laissez-faire approach to regulation, our sort of leaving this alone as the Wild West, has really made it much more like the strip mall of our online world, where we're constantly there being built, targeted, advertised to, used as sort of to feed into the unbelievably massive profits of the tech company, of the sectors themselves. The second issue that I wanted to raise in terms of how we got here, and this is a very simplified sort of picture of this. Happy to talk more in the break about other options, but I think these are sort of three of the key ones. One of them is the lack of domestic and international coordination. So it's really interesting. Initially, there was, and I think to some extent there continues to be, really good cooperation on internet protocols. So on the technological infrastructure underpinning the web. The rosy picture is changing a little bit. It's beyond the scope of today's discussion, but there's some moves on the part of some of the regimes like China to kind of take over some of the internet governance organizations. These things are happening in different ways. But I'd say largely it's kind of for those of you who don't know, the internet is governed through a series of organizations that are non-hierarchical, that are loosely linked, that govern really the protocols and the way in which these organizations contact to each other. This same kind of non-hierarchical international bodies managing and coordinating the internet and enabling a free flow of information, it's not at all the same when you come to the content layer of the internet. By the content layer, I mean the digital platforms themselves and how we engage with them. And I'll talk in a moment, but the digital platforms, I mean like the social media companies and others. And just to give a really clear example of what this means. So you'll all know it doesn't matter if you're on your university mail or Gmail or Hotmail or whatever email system you use. When you email somebody from your email, it goes to their email, regardless. There's interoperability across everything. That's because the interoperability of email is based on these internet protocols, which are clear and open and shared. It's the STP, SMTP protocols. And so they have a different name, but they all go through the same system. However, if you don't have an Apple phone, you can't join your friends on FaceTime, right? And so it's the content layer decision-making has built these sort of fiefdoms, which is contributing to, and we'll talk about this in a bit, but contributing to this sort of splinternet or the splintering of the internet into different ways. But essentially, what's happened is that same level of cooperation, where it's industry, civil society, and governments, doesn't exist on the content layer. And so what you get is instead at the domestic and international levels, you have within governments themselves and across, what I mean by silos in governments is like different government fiefdoms, different government departments within a government. They all have their own internet policies where they deal with their own issues and they don't always talk to each other, they collaborate. And then between governments, that is, sort of different governments working together, either in international fora or bilateral relationships, they're not as good at coming up with decisions or making decisions together. We'll talk about why that is in a moment, but it's essential that this lack of coordination really means that it's been very difficult to kind of put any rules into place on the internet that are accepted across the world and that kind of can really affect concrete change. I'll give you a couple of examples of what this looks like. Partly because content level policymakers come from domestic perspectives and focus on moderating information. They're driven by the specific issues of where they come from. And so they really grow up through their systems of their historical relationships with content in other media forms. So for example, a lot of countries deal with copyright. Copyright has a long history in their countries, and most countries have slightly different versions of copyright rules, though there are international rules and regulations around it. But when they're looking at how that gets applied in the domestic space, they then apply that on their domestic internet. And we end up getting situations like where in the US, freedom of speech is paramount. And so there are very few considerations put on that, but you've probably seen like DCMA notifications on various internet videos because they're very, very concerned about copyright. While in other places that concern about copyright isn't as important, they're worried about hate speech because of their own domestic considerations, as they put more of their efforts in those areas. And it ends up being the situation where there's not just a disconnect internationally between how governments talk to each other, but in fact, even the language and vocabulary they use. And for those of you working on international security or security issues, you'll know that, or you can imagine the difference between how people in security spaces or security spheres talk to people in media regulation spheres. You know, within a context, it's a different set of vocabulary, it's a different set of considerations, even though it's the same issues. Finally, I want to take a few minutes and talk about the nature of digital platforms. So I think that's kind of the really important reason why we need to take some kind of action in this space, and why it's not simply okay, as we talked about in the first slide, to leave things where they are. Go to the next slide. So here, there are kind of four key things that I want to talk about. As we talked about, sorry, just not, okay, digital platforms. So you'll notice I'm using digital platforms instead of social media platforms. Definitions in this space are really difficult, and I have to say, talking about this in other contexts, it's very easy to get lost in a conversation about definitions that could last for hours. Well, that could be slightly interesting for people in public policy. It doesn't make for the best kind of conversation. I find definitions fascinating. I love definitions. I love performance indicators. Happy to talk about both at length. What I use here, and I think what's important for us to think about, we talk about digital platforms. It's important to remember, as much as we talk about these things as being transnational, they really are largely US-owned multinational companies with unimaginable market power who are optimizing their data collection and analytics abilities to effect monopolies. So, I mean, there are some exceptions, and China has its own suite of companies, some of which have broken into the global sphere. So ByteDance and TikTok is I think, probably the most obvious example right now, but there are others operating in that sphere. And what's interesting about it, when we think about the platforms as being transnational companies, we often sort of think about them, and there's a number of papers it's worth looking at that almost consider them like states in themselves. You know, the actions they take are those states in themselves. But it's an important reminder that they are actually US companies, and as such, the US State Department has and continues to push in its international treaties for particular kinds of treatments for their digital platforms. So for example, in the US Canada-Mexico Free Trade Agreement, there's a section that reinforces something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but is essentially the thing that enables a free internet. So what it does is it frees the platforms from intermediary liability. So they're not liable for the things that get posted. And what the US State Department did is it took that element of US law, which enabled the platforms to grow and become what they are, and it embedded it into international treaties to make sure that other countries are also not able to hold those platforms responsible. Digital platforms offer a range of services on the internet. And so I think it's important to remember when we talk about them, and this is one of the challenges for public policy practitioners working in this space, we very much focus on sometimes called the FANG, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. We talk about social media platforms. We talk about Twitter, Facebook, Google Search, YouTube. But in fact, this covers a wide range of companies, things like Match, Uber, the App Store, gaming sites, Twitch, PlayStation 4. And a lot of the problems that we've experienced in terms of disinformation are also being felt on those spaces too. And it's actually stretching to those. It's a really interesting area. Something that I struggle with when speaking to government partners on this, it can be so difficult to actually keep up with all of the different things going on. There's so much going on in the space. Even just knowing what the different sites are where people are putting their efforts, you know, and you can see the crossover, the spillover between these different areas, between the political and the gaming sites and the conversations, both from white supremacist leveraging of those conversations, but also on the political side, on the sort of extreme opposite end. AOC's Twitch game, for example, of Among Us before Christmas, I think at that point was one of the most watched Twitch events in history. It's also important, and we often talk about digital platforms as one entity, and I'm going to talk about them that way today because it's easier, but they are very different from each other. They have different levels of intervention, they treat data differently, they act differently, and they rely on they have different sort of approaches to their algorithms. So their business models. So really, the business models themselves some of you may have seen, there was a famous congressional hearing a few years ago where Mark Zuckerberg appeared in Congress. And one of the House members asked him, so I don't understand, if Facebook is free, how do you make money? And I don't know if anyone's seen this, but then he answered by saying, well, we sell ads. And you know, in a nutshell, that's what these companies do, is they take the data they get, they optimize it, and then they sell micro-targeted things to advertisers, really to drive people towards these spaces. And it's important to remember that despite any claims they make about good conduct or good actions or what they're doing, their whole point is to get as many people on for as long as possible and to then be able to use that information to sell advertisements to people. And so we looked at, for example, one of the things that's come out in the last few weeks is, as much as Google is now making positive statements about election interference and all those other kinds of things, they also continued selling ads to Gateway Pundit, even while they were selling, pushing false information about the election. So that there still is this push to leverage every situation independently of the sort of morality or the views of the situation. How this micro-targeting works. So I'm not sure if anyone's had this experience where you talk about an issue on the phone with your friend, and then you suddenly get a bunch of ads for Facebook on it. And you think, oh my God, they're listening to my phone conversations. I had that happen to me a couple of years ago when I was thinking about a trip to Iceland. The scary thing is that they're not listening to you. And I'd say that's the scary thing because of how they work. Some of you may know this, but some of the companies will gather as many as 14 million data points on each one of us. And they use those data points through predictive analytics to be able to tell what kind of decisions you may be making in the future, and then to sell that information to to advertisers. So for example, with that, to take that example of the call about Iceland, it wasn't that I was talking to my friend about Iceland, it's that all of the data points they had about me made them know that people in my situation at exactly that moment in life were going to be considering a trip to Iceland. And so they'd be well off sending me or selling me ads to that end. And it's not just that sort of personal element, but it's that as much as they may have been designed to connect friends and to connect people and connect the internet, they're now used by businesses and they're leveraged by all kinds of organizations for nefarious ends. So some of you may know the organization Avaz. It's a not-for-profit group that does investigations and then speaks to shareholders about online platforms and their actions. They did an investigation a couple of years ago, and they proved that Facebook was actually making terrorist content. So what Facebook was doing is it was taking members of listed terrorist entities and it was connecting with them each other. So it says, you might know this person who's also in Daesh, but is not in your network. And so it was trying to draw connections between people. But then it was taking the pictures and videos that they posted of beheadings, car bombings, other things, and it was then linking them together, as Facebook does, into like a collage. So it was actually preparing terrorist content through videos. Now, of course, Facebook tries to take this down, and I'm not putting Facebook on the spot for having done this. They are very active in things like the global fight against terrorism. They're sort of founding member of GIFCT and others. It's just to say the business model and the way the platforms approach these things, it puts them in the position of being able to do this in the lack of regulation and the lack of control. I'm just going to skip through general approach. I mean, I think it's fair to say anyone who's tracked this has tracked their monopoly powers and their tendency to acquire smaller competitive. This came out through the antitrust report this summer of the US Congress. We talked about network communications. What's interesting about this is the rapid multi-directional flow, so that many-to-many, less structured communication model that they use really allows for, makes it very, very difficult to stop bad messaging. So the spread, for example, I mentioned of the Christchurch shooter video and other things, it's very difficult. And so the platforms themselves have stepped in to try and stop this. For example, the spread of WhatsApp messaging in India. But they struggle as that is actually part of the way that the company has worked. And finally, algorithms and the importance of algorithms. I'm sure everyone is aware, but we talk about them a lot, just to say an algorithm at its core is a set of guidelines that describes how to perform a task. But algorithms combined with the automated decision-making combined with artificial intelligence has really enabled the platforms to spread massively and to help them develop this complex picture of us that they can use, but also for them to be able to draw connections between all different things, which is an incredibly important part of their business model, but is also something that contributes to this sort of negative spread of the kinds of things we talked about in the first slide. So for example, there's a study from last January, they conducted a large-scale audit of user radicalization on YouTube, looked at about 300,000 videos over 350 channels, and were able to demonstrate that YouTube is actually a pipeline for radicalization, pushing people towards more extreme content through their own recommender algorithm. All of this means they have this complex picture of us. They have this way of sharing things. They have a communication to be able to spread things around. But finally, the most important part of the way that they operate is they operate within a black box. And so none of what they do is open to scholars, to civil society organizations, or to governments. So these things have been designed and deployed at an unprecedented scale and speed. Regulators can't keep up, governments can't keep up, and they really need to establish the systems, powers, and capabilities to be able to scrutinize these areas. But as the Ada Lovelace Institute notes from a study this summer, they brought together a number of experts on this in an excellent paper. It's not only the lack of regulation, but it's even that it's very difficult to imagine what a methodology would look like that could be employed to inspect them. So I think we all know this, but it's just worth a reminder as we finish talking about the platforms themselves of just how big they are. So 5 years ago, when you look at the top 10 companies in the US, 5 years ago, 90%, the sort of 6 companies had 90% of the combined market capitalization of the 4 tech companies, and now it's completely flipped around. So the 4 tech companies drive the US economy. 75% of the top 10 market capitalization is owned by the big tech companies. Their annual revenues, considering the companies largely don't pay taxes, I'm happy to talk about that as well. Facebook made $70 billion last year, which is around the same as Venezuela's gross domestic product. Alphabet is 161 billion, so more than Ukraine. Apple, 260 billion, more than Vietnam, and Amazon, 280 billion, more than Pakistan. So, you know, almost 5 billion humans are connected on the internet. It's just, the numbers are massive and large. It's just, sometimes it's worth kind of thinking about, that's what we're dealing with when we try to think in the next slide. And I realize I didn't go forward on the slides. I apologize. So this is the picture, if you want to sort of see what it looks like. You can see the difference between these companies versus what the other 6 have. This is why government approaches to this are difficult, and this is why I'm recommending a different kind of way to think about this. So what are governments doing? Basically, what governments are doing fall into 3 broad categories. So some governments are working on, have brought in over the last few years, voluntary compliance measures. So key to this is GIFCT, which I mentioned, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which has been a very effective way. And in fact, I should say on the part of platforms, they have been very open and continue to be very open in fighting terrorism online. And when they're alerted to those things, they're very happy to take them down. The Christchurch Call, which is again, governments and platforms working together post-Christchurch to think about online extremism. For those of you working in the security community, you'll know very well, over the last few years, there's been a shift away from organizations like Al-Qaeda or Daesh towards thinking of groups like white supremacist organizations and others. But as we do that, you know, there needs to be sort of organizations that kind of take that up and work these things through. What I want to talk more about is in the enacting legislation and regulations. Germany, the EU just before Christmas came out with the Digital Services Act. The UK launched the reprisal of its white paper, and they're launching legislation shortly, as are Canada, Australia, and other people. They're sort of bringing in legislation over the next little bit. What's interesting about this, most of the approaches focus on content moderation. So they focus on the content layer rather than necessarily looking at the business models of the companies, or else looking at the sort of the societal impacts of the models. And they also, in their talk about, they talk about harmful content. So they talk about all of these things that drive people towards the kind of places we talked about at the beginning. But in fact, most of the focus is on illegal content. So the EU, at least what Canada has publicly said that it's going to be doing, other countries, there's a real focus on taking down what's already illegal and what's on the platforms, because the platform filters haven't caught it out yet. Similar to Germany with the Netz.de law, the takedown of illegal hate content. However, for most people, the real struggle in this space is on harmful content. So it's really on misogynist content, it's on hate, it's on trolling, it's on a lot of those things that aren't actually illegal in the conversation, but really drive a lot of the negative behaviors and push people away from positions of trust and confidence and belief in each other and connection to democracy. The challenge is that those things aren't actually fixed at the content layer of the internet. Those things are fixed at the technological layer of the internet, where you actually look and see how the recommender algorithms work, how people drive content, all of those kinds of things. And the current models being looked at don't necessarily capture that. Finally, I mentioned rethinking existing approaches. Probably the most important in these is the antitrust powers, and then sort of thinking about how to apply antitrust. And by that I mean competition policy and competition law, for those of you who are not aware. And that's really looking at, are the companies themselves too big? And I think there's a lot of reason to think that. The challenge has been, and the continued challenge is, that the existing antitrust legislation around the world is not really designed for what they call zero price markets. That is, they're consumer protection, and they're supposed to mean that we're not taken advantage of by companies in terms of price gouging, is the way a lot of the different structures are built. However, realistically, these are all free services, and that we pay by giving access to our data and by enabling the buildup of this information. And so those antitrust structures need to be rethought and rebuilt to deal with this current environment. And I mentioned the new scrutiny of the Communications Decency Act, as both the Republicans and the Democrats in the House have said that this will be formed part of the new administration. They're both interested in re-examining this. The Communications Decency Act, as I said, Section 230 is the section that enables, that frees the platforms from intermediary liability so that they can't be held to account for the decisions they made on the platform. What's the risk of all this? What does this matter? So partly each one of these things, all of these different pieces of legislation that are going on, while they're informed by and taking into account the thinking of their other colleagues, they really are going alone approaches. And this has a number of challenges that it poses. First and most importantly, it further splinters the internet. So already we're seeing China carving off part of its internet, Russia trying to carve off part and close part of its internet off. We have the US, the previous administration, pushing things like deplatforming TikTok and other Chinese services, which has a real impact on driving this. Interestingly enough, to give a concrete example, if they'd gone ahead and taken down TikTok, that actually wouldn't have affected China very much. It would have had a massive impact on servers that are held in Europe, because those servers process both TikTok and Facebook, and they would have had to decouple. And so it would, from Facebook, and likely would have actually meant Facebook shutting down until more solutions could have been found in the European markets, because it showed a sort of a disregard or misunderstanding of how those structures actually work on the technological side of the internet. I think, as I said, the other risk of these is they're not focusing on the right issues, so that they are not actually looking at the market power of the tech companies or the way in which the tech company operates. Content issues are really more of a symptom of a societal problem than an issue of the platforms themselves, and they can often be used as an excuse, these standalone legislative solutions, to target political opponents, as we've seen in Singapore and India. And finally, and this is, I think, probably the most important, which leads me to my proposed solution, is it doesn't take into account all of the other countries around the world that are affected by these things. So if you look, probably the most significant change to the internet that all of us have experienced was the EU bringing in the General Data Protection Regulations, the GDPR. Effectively, what that did is it put European privacy regulations on everybody, because the European market was so big that the tech companies simply couldn't restructure their privacy regulations for every individual country. They took the biggest part of their market and they said, this is how we're going to set this up for everyone. As the EU moves forward to the Digital Services Act, as the US moves forward and whatever it does with the new Biden administration, as the UK, Canada, and others move forward, each of them risks putting in place a set of processes and procedures that the tech companies will pick up and apply to everyone. Why is that a problem? It's a problem because they haven't necessarily thought through what are the impact in other places? What's the impact in the global south? Are there other voices that should be part of this conversation that aren't there? And I think finally, I'd say individual countries have been proven to have real challenges of thinking on their own. So some of you may have seen before Christmas or in the fall, Facebook threatened to pull out of Europe after Ireland threatened privacy restrictions so that the Europeans wouldn't have to share their data back with the US and be subject to US Patriot Act provisions. Australia was threatened by Facebook in legal action after they had a news requirement that if they're going to post Australian news, they had to pay for it. And so we do better if we collaborate and work together. This is my final slide, and then we can get to discussion. So we need a new approach. One of the options for a new approach is looking at existing forum and saying, is there an existing forum that's the right kind of mix for this? Is this the thing that brings together the right group of people? The OECD has expanded over a number of years. They're doing some really exciting work on the digital platform space. The UN has an interest, I think, especially on the sort of two opposite sides of this, one on cultural expression and the other on anti-terrorism. G20, I think, is probably a really great candidate to think about a place that some of this could be housed. The problem is that there's no consensus amongst countries about the way to deal with this, and there's no obvious place for countries to start those conversations. What I would say is, what I'm recommending is, and what we've created is this thing called the Global Platform Governance Network. And what we're doing through that is we're bringing together domestic policy stakeholders. So that is government officials working in domestic departments who are seized with media policy, regulation, anti-terrorism policy, internet policy, the regulators themselves, so the people who are actually looking at enacting this work, as well as the legislative staff who support ministers and parliamentarians in bringing forward these ideas. The way in which public policy works often, international sections of governments are very good at developing connections with each other. They're good at diplomatic relations. They're good at drawing international treaties. They're good at sort of building those areas. They're not necessarily the right people to be talking about the application of domestic policy. And so with the Global Platform Governance Network, by bringing domestic policy people together, what we're doing is we're enabling better domestic policy outcomes. That is, they can learn from their colleagues internationally. We're also enabling an understanding of what works and what doesn't. So sort of a shortcut past the problems that people have experienced and an understanding of how things play out in different places. And finally, and I think most importantly, we're giving a voice to some of those countries that aren't necessarily part of every conversation, but really need to be there in terms of informing the larger issue. If what we're going to do is we're going to combat the kind of problems we're seeing in online platform governance that we experienced in the past week and we've experienced over the last number of years, we need to have all of the different players at the table. We need to understand the challenges, how those challenges play out at the local levels, how they play to the regional levels, but also ways in which we can make sure that our individual domestic pieces of legislation don't run counter to challenges or to experiences that are experienced in other parts of the world. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. Open up the floor. I'm going to stop my sharing my screen. Although you can see I do have one final slide. Questions?
So you, Mac, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. This was really an illuminating talk. I have a question that I think arises from the discussion that's happening in the US right now and the political situation. But there's, Jack Dorsey from Twitter, I think, has gotten a lot of praise and a lot of flack as well for his handling of the situation. And he has, been writing today and over the past, month or two about a new initiative called Blue Sky, which I wonder if you know anything about, just kind of this idea of creating a decentralized kind of social media platform. And I'd love to hear kind of any thoughts that you have on the development of that sort of framework for social media.
Yeah, I'd seen this. Sorry, I'm not good. Thanks very much for your question. I think that's a really great question. And it's a really great example. I think it's very easy when you're working in this to demonize the social media platforms and to say that they're coming at this from a solely a money-making perspective. And I hope I didn't sound like that's what I was saying, because a lot of them got into this. And you sort of hear even Mark Zuckerberg talk about this. They're very very keen on the sort of strengthening free speech, on creating a space for people to talk, on allowing these things to happen. And it's one of the reasons why they've struggled so much. I think, so when I read a little bit about this, and I guess what I would worry a little bit about is these kinds of things. So how to say this? So two things. One of them is they kind of already exist. And I'm not entirely sure why when I read this, and I need to get sort of more information about it, but, it feels like it's hard to see why this wouldn't be just, if they really believed in this, why Twitter wouldn't be then sort of solidifying some of the existing things that are there, or changing their own approaches, or moving away from that. But it kind of feels like them trying to own part of this. Like, I was really questioning what would Twitter's relationship be with this organization, or with this group. It's funny, I'm not putting Jack Dorsey in the same group, but I remember reading a commentary this summer when Amazon was announcing, that they were going to put all of this money into all of these different things. And people said, yeah, that's really great. Why don't you just pay taxes? And then, we can actually do it properly. There's an element for this for me that it's hard not to see Twitter as being self-serving in this space. It kind of feels maybe like Twitter's trying to gain ownership of a space that already exists and could just instead be strengthened. I'm not sure if that answers your question. One thing I didn't say that I would mention that I find really interesting, there's been a lot of conversation about Twitter's actions, Facebook actions, others. There's been very little conversation about Amazon deplatforming Parler, which I find incredibly striking. Excuse me, sorry, I got a frog in my throat. That here's a company that has basically the ability to take something off the internet. Like, Parler's gone. You can't access it.
Right.
They may find something else as well, but with the Amazon Cloud Services, they control some enormous amount of the internet, like 90% of the internet. And their ability to pull people off, like, that's crazy. I'm not saying that Parler shouldn't be taken down, but it's more that one company, based on its own terms of service, could have that kind of market power. So I know that was a different question than you asked, but I do find that.
I was actually going to ask a question regarding Parler when taken off, so thank you for getting there before. Though it does, so is it a kind of question that comes to my mind in that regard, particularly in the fact that Parler was a particular focus for law enforcement. So it coming down, one of the worries was there was the potential loss of evidence, but thankfully a researcher held on to a large number of posts that were made there. But because everything's becoming decentralized from Parler, and you see a lot of essentially Telegram, Signal, and Discord are a few of the apps and just messaging and networking applications that have seemed to grow since Parler has left. So what are your kind of thoughts on kind of keeping these certain the centralization of these particular groups for law enforcement at least?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I mean, I think it's a real struggle, and one of the things researchers, and as you well know, researchers have complained for a long time about the takedowns and the way the takedowns are run, and the sort of black box nature of takedowns. So one of the things is, and I heard a couple of researchers at Data and Society talk about this in a couple of papers last year, when they're studying hate speech and other things on YouTube. You have to recognize that they're only getting to see the stuff that made it through the YouTube's filters, right? So they don't actually know what people are attempting to put up. They don't know, and through that, they don't actually know what's being shared through the secret communication channels, right? These sort of closed off networks, as you're talking about, the peer-to-peer encrypted networks, where there really is very little visibility for law enforcement and for others. It's also hard, even after the takedown events, as I say, for people to go back, and this is a problem that goes across not law enforcement only, but even sort of international human rights activists and others, sort of being able to see what was there and what was captured. At the same time, I have a slightly different view on the takedown of these sort of mainstream platforms and the push to people towards the sort of Signal, Telegram, and other sort of peer-to-peer encrypted. The real risk that we get, I think, on things like Parler, and even more so on platforms like YouTube, when you allow the hateful speech or harmful speech to remain on, that kind of, alt-light, as some people talk about, or the sort of, any one of these kinds of things, is it's such a great draw into those organizations, right? So I wouldn't recommend to anyone to do this. One of my students did this a couple of years ago, and his YouTube channel was filled with hate for about 6 months. But he looked up a white supremacist group on Facebook and immediately was fed all kinds of teaser videos on YouTube about, because he was a white male who was 20, 21. And so he was fed all this stuff. It's like, why are you disgruntled? Why is the world not meeting your expectations? It's because of this assault on white people. It's all of these different myths that go through the story. that then is designed to bring people into these sort of encrypted chat rooms that you're talking about. What I think is really important is by taking them off these major platforms, they lose a huge ability to be able to recruit new members. So that as they can keep talking to themselves and they can keep passing these messages on themselves, and it becomes, as you say, very difficult for law enforcement to track them. But at the very least, it puts a thorn in their side of trying to drive these larger conversations. And for those of you who haven't seen it, it's very worthwhile for those working in this area. Look at Joan Donovan's work and at Shorenstein at Harvard. Her team, they have a media manipulation casebook, it's called. But one of the things they talk about there is how these alt organizations actually sort of start conversations on like Reddit or on 4chan or 8chan or these other places. And they talk about how to manipulate them. And then they get themselves into the main media and they get people on YouTube and they like draw people in, right? They've got a very specific way of approaching this. I think taking some of these sites down from those main sites and stripping them away really does more to disrupt that kind of that system than a lot of other actions we could take. There still remains a problem with the end-to-end encrypted sites, and I think there, it's unfortunately it's moving back to more traditional law enforcement tools of infiltrating organizations and sort of human intelligence sources and other kinds of areas. But I think at least that disruption is worthwhile. I hope that answered your question.
Oh, it does completely. I believe Martin had a question for you as well.
I saw that. So I should say I'm not an expert on Chinese social media companies, but I think the way in which the Chinese companies work, that's much more useful for them, or that they're able to carry these things out. They have a sort of absolute control over the content of the conversations. And so the Chinese government has not been afraid, and there's some really excellent work done on WeChat. Unfortunately, WeChat tends to not be accessible except to people who have Chinese language skills. And it's not as many people who are working in this space looking at countering disinformation and others and harmful content. So the media companies themselves, I'd say when they take down or when they host misogynist content, both times are doing it with the explicit consent or at least complicity with the state. So for example, it's very common when looking at attacks on human rights activists in Hong Kong, especially female human rights activists, to see them attacked using misogynist or very gendered language. There was a series of attacks on one lawmaker that kept referring to her as a comfort woman, trying to link back to Japanese sex slaves in the Second World War, and commenting on her, sort of tying her into a whole set of ideals around that. But almost certainly that was done with the consent of the state. So it's kind of a different spread. You have on WeChat, there's a number of things now being studied where we're looking at the ability of the state to, when people post dissenting views on WeChat, to then track them down even in foreign countries and have them contacted by agents of the state to sort of try and control or affect change on the conversations themselves. I hope, Martin, that answers your question. It ends up being a very different thing because it's, to some extent, they're used as a tool for state control. I'll take that as a yes.
Yeah, I think so. And so along the line, so what? Just a quick question about the Global Platform Governance Network. So what sort of reactions have you seen so far from Western governments, countries and lawmakers, and the global South? Like, what is the general reactions that's being seen? Is there being a decent uptake of interest, or is it still very much in the planning stages currently? And
no, thanks very much for your question. It's actually been astoundingly positive. Whenever you launch a new enterprise, you're never really sure what kind of response you're going to get. And so when I set this up, I did it very much from a for those of you who've done social science research, I took like a snowball sample approach to this, where I talked to people that I knew in other countries. They talked to people that they knew, because I wasn't simply looking for country participation, but also for particular kinds of people. That is, those kinds of people who realize that the solution to this is working across silos within government and working between governments to try and sort of harmonize efforts and to share ideas and thoughts. And so I reached out to people, and through that they reached out to people and so on, and we've grown. What I found more than anything is that most domestic policymakers working on these issues would love to be in better contact with their international partners and have no idea who they are. So when the Foreign Office in the UK or State Department officials in the US or Global Affairs in Canada or others connect, they have a built-in structure to be able to build up networks with people. That is, sort of, you call the embassy, you go through the High Commission, you go through these different groups, and you can immediately sort of link into networks. But when domestic policymakers are looking at this, they very often don't even know who and which governments are responsible for the same set of tasks. So to give an example, some of the countries that I've been dealing with, like Ireland, Canada, they're tackling these issues of disinformation, platform governance, online regulation through their cultural and media departments, the UK to some extent as well. Other countries, so France, Latvia, others, they're handling it through their foreign office, or they have multiple groups that are handling this work. In other places, it's like the Home Office or Home Affairs or the security departments in Australia and in others. The work is really being run through there. So it's not even like there's an interlocutor that you necessarily connect with. And so what I found is when I've been able to reach out to and connect with people in those places, they're incredibly excited to meet their colleagues and to have a sense that they're not actually in this alone. I found, and that's especially true when dealing with, I've talked to a number of people in Sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia and South America, where they can feel incredibly isolated in the spaces they're working, and to sort of be able to connect. Now, that's not to say everyone shares the same set of problems. Some of my colleagues working in Nigeria, for example, or Central Europe, they're dealing with disinformation campaigns, but they're not from things on Facebook. They're dealing with disinformation campaigns from traditional media sources, or they're dealing with actual civic insurrection, or they're different kind of variants of different shades of the same problems. But what's really so striking is to see, especially when bringing people together, to find that level of connection between them. So for example, we had a meeting this summer, and one of our participants from Brazil was talking about legislation, counter disinformation legislation that was being discussed in the Brazilian parliament. And she was presenting and talking about how difficult it was to be combating disinformation as a legislator when your president, Bolsonaro, was so actively a proponent of disinformation, that is, a purveyor of disinformation. And for her US colleagues who were on the call, from the sort of people working in the House of Representatives and people working with the US government space, it was like a light came on. For them to realize that there are other people in the world who are struggling with these same challenges, when they had an executive branch from the president supporting disinformation, and as legislators, they were trying to work to counter disinformation and how to kind of make that work. So I think finding those common grounds of this common space, so far at least, has been incredibly well received. I mean, I think the challenge is going to be in our next phase. So what we've launched in the last week, actually, is we've launched working groups to try and harmonize some of these efforts on a really practical scale. So we've launched a research working group where what we're trying to do is actually coordinate research planning with our partners. Governments, as you probably know, they invest a lot in research. So some of you on the call may be recipients of government grants for some of your research efforts, but they fund research, they pay researchers, they do in-house research, they look at research collaborations, but that's almost never harmonized with other governments. And so one of the things that I learned as getting into this space was when I was working for the Canadian government, I was paying a firm to do research for me, and I found out that the exact same firm was doing almost the same set of research for the UK and the EU governments as well. And none of us knew because none of us talked to each other about it. And so it really runs the risk of duplicating efforts and then not actually being aware of other challenges that are on the horizon and maybe not realized yet.
And were these firms were they just essentially just sending out the same report to everyone else, or was it kind of just they were doing the same thing 3 times to 3 different teams?
I mean, a bit of both. They weren't being unethical. I mean, they weren't being dishonest. It's that we put out a call for proposals for research on X. Mm-hmm. If they already had a paper written, they could still apply for that proposal. It's sort of, there's nothing incorrect about doing that, but it's incredibly wasteful. Mm-hmm. And especially in a situation where current research on disinformation and platform governance issues and internet policy, there's so many things that we don't know and understand. We really need to make sure that we're covering all the bases. And this kind of approach the current approach where we don't talk to each other means we're really not leveraging our existing abilities. Now, the other challenge that I think is equally important in research, and we talked about this yesterday or Tuesday, is knowledge translation. And I say knowledge translation and the ability of putting research into the hands of lawmakers and actually having them use it is probably one of the biggest challenges collectively that research faces. And this space is probably more problematic than some others because there's so much difficulty in skill sets that a lot of people within government and also people within, as lawmakers don't have the data analytics abilities to be able to understand some of the research that's being produced, or don't have the legal backgrounds to be able to understand the sort of legal arguments. And yet they still sort of forge ahead with decisions, not necessarily understanding those different pieces.
Well, that's all fantastically interesting, actually. I'm just going to quickly see, does anyone else have any sort of questions before we let Chris have some freedom and enjoy his day? Or Mackenzie?
Sure. I just have one more question. So thinking about, these issues of free speech versus hate speech versus dangerous speech, I wonder if you've worked with any of, kind of a number of organizations or projects that are working on countering dangerous speech. The Dangerous Speech Project is one of them. Project Over Zero is another. I think that they're just doing very interesting communications research and thinking about it from kind of a social psychology standpoint that I think is quite important to kind of mix with governance and legislation. So I'd love to hear any thoughts on that stream of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, those are great examples. Actually, Susan Benish, who runs the Dangerous Speech Project, spoke at one of our meetings in the fall. And she works quite closely with some of our colleagues.
She's brilliant, yeah.
Really fantastic, wow. Do you know, for me, I think, and it was a point that I was trying to make in the discussion of the legislative solutions that are being considered, there's a real problem with the approach that says content is the issue we need to deal with, and that platforms should take down content that's offensive. Illegal content, I think, is something slightly different, and I think platforms probably, there's a stronger case to make to say that platforms should be taking down things that are sort of clearly illegal, especially on an international level. But even there, you run into differences between different countries and what constitutes illegality, and there's interjurisdictional problems, there's all kinds of other things. One of the things that I think is so important with the way we approach these issues, I think this is one of the reasons why what I would suggest, and I think we need to focus on, is looking at the amplification efforts. So thinking about the way in which platforms amplify voices, and thinking about the way in which their algorithms work, and thinking about the size and scope and scale and spread and interconnectivity of the platforms. That is the business model and the structure rather than the actual content. Because I think, something that Susan talks about, I think really quite well, is that there's an enormous risk of stepping in and taking down hate speech, or danger, I think what she better classes as dangerous speech, because the incentive will always be on the platforms to take down more than they should. That is, they're always going to overstep, because what they're worried about is they're worried about breaching the law, about administrative monetary penalties, of all of those different kinds of things. And I think what we need to do is to think, what's the way in which we can preserve free speech? We can enable speech to have a place, while at the same time engaging with and leveraging digital media literacy, thinking about the way in which we engage with speech online, thinking about the way we engage with populations online, to have a different kind of intersection with the speech that's there. I don't know if you know her work, Rebecca McKinnon from Ranking Digital Rights. She wrote a brilliant paper about this in the fall. She was at UCLA for a year, and she talked about the way universities deal with free speech. And she was trying to argue that platforms could do a lot of the same. We could use the same kind of models for free speech that are put there. And a big part of her point was, when all we do is look at what's being said and not how it's being spread, then what we do is it's like somebody's throwing gasoline on a fire. We're busy putting out the flames. We're not actually stopping the person with the gas. And I think that kind of reorienting ourselves towards that would, I think, be really useful. The problem that face and the problem that legislation in this space faces is that that's not popular. What people want to see is they say, I saw this thing that was really offensive online, I wanted that taken down. Or I see this thing, that feels like that's the problem that you want to solve. The problem you want to solve is the problematic speech and not the content. That free speech as a concept is too, especially for people living in sort of the transatlantic, Western democracies, it's too abstract as a concept, or what they can see right in front of them is this impact of the content. Mac, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I just wanted your general thoughts. That's brilliant. Yeah. And I'll look up McKinnon's work.
Yeah, it's really, really good. And I'll just say, if anyone on this call or any of the people who had to leave have any other questions, I'm more than happy to. Ethan can share my my email. You're really happy to reach out and talk more about this. I think this is really, right now, it's really essentially, one of my colleagues who runs an organization called Reset, he was asked at an interview somewhat recently, said, why are you so focused on this? Like, isn't climate change a big problem? Aren't these other things big problems? And I think that the challenge is without a common belief in truth, without a common connection to each other, without this civic engagement, without a interconnection between governments and researchers and civil society organizations, we can't actually tackle any of the other problems because we're not coming at it from a basis of common understanding and common conversation. And this, for me, feels like one of those things we really need to kind of address almost as like a first principle, as like a starting principle.
Yeah, it's very much within like the lines of you can't build a home upon quicksand type of thing. So
yeah.
So Chris, do you have any? So aside from that, do you have any other closing remarks that you'd like to share with everyone? Or
no, really, I just want to say thanks so much for listening, and I think this is such an amazing. I was saying to Ethan ahead of this. This is such an amazing initiative to put together that I think to see graduate students kind of taking this initiative and making this happen is really exciting. And I wish you all luck with your programs as you go forward.
Thank you very much, Chris. And there'll be a summary document put together after this for all those that couldn't attend or don't have the bandwidth to attend or anything like that. And in that, we'll link a number of resources that were discussed during the talk. So with that, if Chris, if you can stay on the line just for the debrief, thank you everyone for joining us and have a great day.